Welcome to Application Modernization. I am Brian Landerman, and I'm on the AWS Enterprise Strategy team, and we're a group of former CIOs and CTOs that all led large-scale migrations of our company's infrastructure to AWS while tackling the people, process, and cultural changes necessary to really drive business agility. I talked to customers, hundreds of customers over the last couple of years, and what I found is that we're all facing similar challenges where we're trying to drive business agility or respond to digital disruption, but we have this legacy technology estate that's largely holding us back. But when we hear modern applications, we tend to discuss serverless technologies like AWS Lambda or AWS Fargate. And that can feel very far away when you have this old, outdated legacy technology. So today, I want to talk about some patterns and techniques that will help you modernize that technology to really capture that business agility you're after. We know this is important because if you look at this data from Gartner, almost 50% of CEOs said they're being challenged by their board of directors to make progress in digital business, while 2 out of 3 business leaders believe that they must pick up the pace of digitalization to remain competitive. So my team talks to customers and we often present on this idea of becoming a high-frequency enterprise. And we talk about these 7 patterns we've identified that low-frequency enterprises tend to follow, and 7 patterns that they're really looking to adopt to embrace that high-frequency environment. Those patterns fall into 3 categories. It's really about deciding what to work on, how you organize that work, and then really the delivery of the work itself. And what we see is that enterprises tend to focus on these 4 areas to emerge from that low-frequency environment. And it's really about breaking up the work, investing in your workforce, automating your bureaucracy, and building it in, don't bolt it on. Now, when I talk about application modernization, I tend to focus on 2 areas. However, given the time we have today, I'm going to dive deep into break up the work. Now, as you see, it says monolith to microservices, but it's not just about creating smaller components. It's also the people side of things. And so we'll start there with building smaller teams that own products and services and organize around customer outcomes. It's really important to tackle both pieces because small components without small teams really just increases your complexity. So when we're talking about our people, I think it's important to look at the history of our organization, of our leadership, of the types of employees we've hired and what we've asked them to deliver. If you look back at autocratic leadership, where we're organized around activities and our employees are order takers delivering tasks, we certainly moved away from that and embracing more project-oriented delivery and being more democratic in our leadership, and built our organization around functions. In IT, that's everything from QA to operations or development or security. And our employees are largely participants, working together, kind of emerging out of these functional areas to deliver a project together, but then returning to that functional area or shifting to another project. But modern application development and modern organizations have really embraced this new way of working, this team-based organization where leadership is now focused on serving those teams, on removing blockers and ensuring that the teams have an environment where they can be successful, where they can optimize their work. Because we've moved away from telling our employees what to do, and instead we're hiring problem solvers and we're bringing problems to them. We're providing them with all the context that they need to solve that problem so they can deeply understand that customer problem, so they can work to deliver outcomes that the customer cares about, that your business cares about. So it's a very different way of working and requires very different leadership. Paired with that, though, we also need to break down this segregated set of outcomes where IT is typically focused on operational excellence, on cost optimization or security and compliance, while the business is really focused on driving speed and agility, value and results, new ideas and innovation. our customers care about all of these things, and it's important that we put all of these things on the table and prioritize the right efforts and ensure that from a customer perspective, we're focused on the right things and moving them forward in an appropriate manner. After all, our customers fuel our products and services. So we should, within product delivery, really be focused on that customer experience. After all, that customer experience drives usage. The more our products get used, the more feedback we get. We can get the data about which areas of our product or service that they're using most, or where it's falling short, or perhaps where the next set of improvements should go. And those improvements lead to an improved customer experience, which leads to the growth of our products and services of our business, which then allows us to create new experiments, new products, new customer experience, and round we go in this flywheel. And it's really important to have both that focus on the customer as well as the opportunity and the space to gather that data and respond to that feedback that you're getting. So with that in mind, at Cox Automotive, so I was the CTO there prior to joining AWS in February of last year, we had this challenge where we wanted to accomplish those things. We had grown through over 40 acquisitions. We had everything from IBM RPG on the iSeries, Oracle Exadata, IBM Data Power, Oracle Coherence, Java, .NET, and Python. I had 2,500 in my group across 15 primary locations, and each one of those locations was roughly one-to-one with an acquisition. So they each had a diverse set of culture and technologies and techniques, and it made it very difficult to deliver on what our customers wanted, which was an integrated set of products. Following these acquisitions, our customers said, hey, look, you have autotrader.com, KBB.com. You have dealer.com with a platform powering 60% of dealership websites in the US. And then you built a CRM and an ERP and a service management solution that sits in our dealership and improves our operations, along with other solutions. But you are really in a position to improve consumer car buying, to increase transparency and trust, and also make it much easier once you've made your, narrowed your purchase decision or made the decision to come in store and make it really easy to complete that transaction and to return to the dealer. And have all of that be very efficient for the dealership. We were in a position to improve upon that. And so our customers desperately needed to connect to those solutions. So we took Scaled Agile framework off the shelf and largely did Scrum. So we had these small teams that we created and, what Amazon would call 2 pizza teams. And you can argue whether or not that's appropriate. If the idea is that they're small enough to be fed by 2 pizzas, they're roughly 5 to 10 people in size, maybe 2.5 or 3 pizza team, I don't know. But we had about 350 Scrum teams that we brought online across the entire enterprise. And we used Scaled Agile framework to really create a structure on top of these teams that allowed us to create connectivity in our priorities and a common cadence, because we chose to have each Scrum team start their sprint on the same day and end their sprint on the same day. We did program increment planning. Everyone planned at the same time, started on the same day, ended on the same day. So when we're working to say, hey, I need this, team A, could you complete your work on this new API on sprint 2 because I plan to adopt it in sprint 4, and that would allow us to collaborate in sprint 3. We could do that sort of thing because we were planning at the same time, because our sprints started and ended at the same time. So we use Scaled Agile framework to create that common cadence, where previously we had different ways of delivering different cadences and really different practices. And so we use the framework also to create a level playing field. We thought it was really important that we take that customer perspective and we bring it into how we operate. DevSecOps talks a lot about tooling and technology and behaviors, and there's a lot in the mix. But one of the things that I really like about it is it's also about breaking down the silos and unifying our customers' concerns. So yes, they care about feature development. Yes, they care about security and operations and reliability and performance. All of those things matter to our customers. So why have we internally segmented those things and have different groups caring about different aspects of it with no one really caring about the entire picture? So we said, look, we have lines of business. Each line of business has a president. Each line of business had multiple business units. Those business units had GMs. So we chose to align Scott Digital Framework to that existing structure because that's how our P&Ls were aligned as well. But we took product engineering and architecture and we created leaders that aligned to those business partners, but could surface, which was a new muscle for us, but they worked to surface those architectural concerns, architectural runway or performance and reliability. Or from an engineering perspective, hey, look, if we worked on these improvements, we could deliver value much more quickly. So we wanted to create that level playing field so that, well, while ultimately our business leader had the final say in prioritization, we needed to provide them with all the things that mattered to our customers so that when we made those prioritization decisions, they were kind of eyes wide open and the best set of decisions that we could make given all of the information. So that was really important for us. But then to ensure that we were all aligned and accountable to deliver on those priorities, we changed our organizational structure. And for me, this is really important. We talk a lot in the industry, the technology industry, about this idea of the frozen middle, where you set to transform your broader organization, but middle management or middle areas of the organization really aren't incentivized to make the change or don't understand what it means for them. So it's important for us to create this connectivity where essentially your manager cared about the things that you were delivering because they had agreed with their business partner that their teams were going to deliver these things and so on down the line. So for us, you take the media portfolio, there was Dealer.com was a business unit and a solution train. There was an SVP of engineering for media. There was a VP of engineering for Dealer.com. Dealer.com had a website product. That was a product line that had a release train. There was a director of engineering on that release train. And then there were a bunch of teams contributing to that product line. Well, the managers of those teams reported to the director of engineering of the website release train and up the chain. And so it made sure that we were all focused on delivery and we were all connected to the same set of priorities. Now, we complemented this with central organizations like architecture and agile delivery and engineering operations so that they could really work from kind of the side of this structure to ensure that we were building well-architected solutions, that the behaviors that we had in place and the outcomes we were looking to measure and the problems we were bringing to our teams were all the right things in the right way of thinking about it. Or from an operations perspective, that we were improving our delivery practice. So we complemented that structure, but chose to do this within engineering to really create that alignment around delivery and that accountability. So that's just a little bit about, kind of one way to break up teams and make smaller teams and scale that within your enterprise to get more focused on your customer. And with that, you can now break up your components and give those teams ownership of these smaller components to allow them to release on their own cadence and be more independent and autonomous. So naturally, when we talk about smaller components, we'll talk monolith to microservices. And just a quick example, I'm sure you understand the difference, but a simple example of, let's take a blog. It has users that might be commenting or creating threads on posts. And so we might present this in a common user interface. We could certainly accomplish it on the left as a monolith, a single application, a single database, or we could break it up into its independent concerns, users, threads, and posts. And we can have separate APIs and separate databases, maybe even separate user interfaces that come together through a common user experience. So before we kind of dive in, and we're not going to debate the monolith versus microservices, there's no battle coming here, but I think it's important to really ground ourselves in some antipatterns as we look at how we might build towards microservices. So a couple that I'll call out, one is the premature optimization. I think one of the pitfalls of microservices is that the name implies this small thing, very small thing. And you could easily start in this move to microservices by thinking that you need to make all of these very small components. That would require you to prematurely optimize those components without fully understanding everything about the component. Instead, I think it's best to shrink and refactor over time. Now, the other is changing your code and making updates to the software, adding features, really tends to result in complexity, increasing complexity of your solution. The alternative is to really use that change to intentionally simplify your solution. And also moving away from this idea of big upfront assumptions that we know things in advance, and instead constantly changing and learning and improving what we have or how we go about doing things. One of the challenges here, though, is that in order to accomplish these things on the right, you really need to have ownership. And so when we're creating these small teams, it's important that they own features and functions. As you saw in the structure that we had at Cox Automotive, each of those small teams owned a feature or function that rolled up into a product that we brought to market. So it's important that we have that ownership so that they have the space to shrink and refactor, that they own the improvements over time, and instead of just kind of dropping in, making some changes and leaving. Because the reality is that, and I'm not encouraging that you build monoliths. I think 12-factor apps is a really great starting point, but I absolutely would encourage you to build coarse-grained services and to live in this sweet spot for a period of time in the space of learning and the idea of learning. And so in that sweet spot, you can look at, what are the boundaries? How do my data or functionality, how do they relate to each other or affect each other? What are the usage patterns? Are users kind of really interested in one area, but maybe not so much in the other, or they only need it a few times here and there versus every day on a regular basis? And what about the rate of change? How often are we, are new feature requests coming in, or are we having to improve the experience of this individual thing? All of those things will help you understand the boundaries and how to break things apart, because the reality is that this coarse-grained set of services is only good for a period of time. That there is a pivot point and a decline of productivity coming. And again, that's really because change increases complexity over time. So we want to use that change to intentionally simplify. So we need to forecast that pivot point and make sure that we're breaking down our coarse-grained services or a monolith in time to avoid that decline of productivity. And so the good news is that there's a handful of patterns that enterprises are using to really break down those monoliths or coarse-grained services and make them finer grained. And the first is event decoupling. So a simple example that you should be familiar with, let's say you're going to a restaurant, there's counter service, fast food restaurant, and imagine if the person taking your order then ran back and threw your burger on the grill, and then ran over and dropped your fries in, and then filled up your drink and grabbed a top and a straw, and then ran back and flipped your burger, and then went and packaged your fries, and then threw cheese on your burger, and then packaged the burger, and came back to the counter with your order fully complete. Certainly possible. Sounds pretty chaotic, though, I think. But really, this is what we're asking our monoliths to do, is this work that is very much related to each other. It's all a single order for a single person, but it's a very different set of work. And so we can take this and we can use event decoupling to break this down. And we can say, hey, look, by actually placing the order, when that order is placed, that's an event. At that point, I know that a cheeseburger was ordered, that a large fry was ordered, and a lemonade was ordered. And so I can tell these individual stations, go make a cheeseburger, package some, make a large fry. And when they're complete, these kind of black box things can produce the burger, the fries, the drink. We can package that back together and still provide the same experience of single point for order place, single point for order delivery, but we're accomplishing it in a very different way. This is how we would accomplish microservices. We would take each of these stations and consider them a microservice. And we use events to kind of partition off and parse out the different activities, but then unify them back together to create that common experience. So that's event as decouplers. And it's a great pattern because it pairs well with another pattern, which is the Strangler pattern. So Martin Fowler wrote about this back in 2004 after visiting the Queensland coast of Australia, where he experienced the Strangler figs, which would they'd start off in the upper branches of a tree and eventually make their way down and root in the soil. And they would eventually kind of strangle their tree, their host, eventually killing their host. And so he recognized this as an interesting analogy for the way that we go about breaking down our applications. We had historically embarked on these large transformations of solutions or re-architectures, And they tended to fail because we were tackling too much at once. And so he saw this pattern as a way to say, look, well, if we can slowly do this over time, and that's a more appropriate approach. And so what we should really be doing is prioritizing our work. We should be looking at our applications and saying, where is change happening most often, or where are we slowest, and that's having a negative impact on our business? Let's prioritize that area first, and let's modernize that. And then once that's done, let's take a fresh look and prioritize the next piece. So by using event decoupling, it's one of the techniques that you can use. Once you have that prioritization, you can use event decoupling to kind of separate out that thing, essentially put a shim in place so that your monolith and this new modernized component can coexist. So the Strangler pattern is a great way to slowly improve this over time based on actual business needs versus assuming that the entire thing should be written and maybe kind of falling down along the way. So the last pattern that I'd like to cover is domain-driven design. Now, I'll admit that the event decoupling and Strangler pattern are much more of an iterative approach. Domain-driven design definitely requires some upfront thinking and design work. And that's because it takes a pretty complex problem and looks to break it down into smaller pieces so that, again, these smaller teams can own the various pieces. So you can take this example of a sales context or support context. So this notion of bounded context is that there are different data sets necessary when you're doing different things, but there tends to be connectivity between them. So when I'm supporting a customer, yes, I need to know the customer, I need to know the products they have, but there might be tickets and defects that they've reported on that product. So I need to know all of that information in order for me to properly support them. Well, in the sales context, I might also need to know the tickets that they've submitted, but I may be organizing or going to sell them a product based on opportunities and how we've segmented our territories internally. So there's different data sets in different contexts. They're unified through this linkage, which you see on customer and product. So domain-driven design takes that big problem, which you might say is my customer database or my customer data set. That could be a monolithic data set. Instead, let's break it down into the individual pieces, still create that connectivity so I can traverse the entire model, but I have them broken down into these smaller pieces so that I can have smaller teams working on them. Now, one example of using this model was from BMW. Now, they had this configurator platform where, if you were to go to bmwusa.com and let's say you wanted to configure the 5 Series and you wanted to make it your own, well, you can pick different entertainment systems or different wheels or engines, but there's a certain set of combinations that are actually able to be manufactured. So there's a lot of logic that goes into figuring out what is possible. And there's lots of different times that you might want to know what's possible or what goes together. And a great example is accessories or parts that you might want to add after the fact. Well, what fits with what based on different certain scenarios. So they had this complex system that they knew really well. But the problem is that they had really traversed this path that we talked about where they had gone past this pivot point and reached this decline of productivity. The development speed had become slower and slower, and even minor changes led to large refactorings. So they knew they needed to move out of this place. And so they embarked on a journey to build these small self-contained microservices. But in order to do so, they wanted to break down this broad data set, this complex environment that they had. They used domain-driven design to do that, to really understand those bounded contexts and opportunities to create connectivity while separating the data models. And they use that to drive the design of their RESTful services. But they took it a step further where they also broke out their batch processes. So it wasn't just from the API consumer perspective that they had segregated duties, but also on the backside so that their data could be processed independently and could be tailored to the needs of that specific API. could also be scaled based on the needs of that API. And so that holistic approach, and by starting with domain-driven design, they took this really complex problem and were able to simplify it and build these small independent microservices. So I want to leave you with this quote from Brenton at Petco, because we just covered a lot. We covered from a people perspective, organizational structure, how teams are set up and organized and what they own, how we connect our delivery practice, how that then connects into how we've broken down our components, different techniques, and iterating on that improvement over time. It's a lot. It's certainly a lot. But as he says, you have to remember that this is a journey. We want to move away from a project that starts and ends and really embark on this journey. And it's really about starting and choosing something impactful, right? Kind of what we talked about with the Strangler pattern, and working to decompose it and iterate over time. I think it's really important to be creative and to keep progressing, because you may encounter some things that you can't really decompose, or maybe aren't a priority to decompose. So how do you get creative about that to allow these components to coexist in the environment as you're working through this prioritized set of refactoring or re-architecture? I think that making progress and keeping progressing is a really important aspect of this journey. So I'll leave you with a couple links here. Executive Insights is a great resource for ebooks and lots of conversations. We have a podcast out there that my team does. We talk about some of the challenges that enterprises are facing as they embark on this transformation journey. We have a blog that it looks at all sorts of different things. Again, a lot around leadership and transformation, governance, and that sort of thing. If you want, take a picture of my QR code here, connect with me on LinkedIn. I'd be happy to share my presentation with you. Thank you so much for joining me. I truly appreciate it. Please don't forget to take the survey at the end of this session. Cheers.